Okay, so we're going to start the course off with a presentation on industrialization. The industrial era in American society was a time of immense growth, and so we're going to be focusing on that. Um, Industrialization, you sort of understand what it is. It's the process of moving a society away from an agrarian, rural society where people live on farms and um, grow their own food and make their own products to an industrialized society where people live primarily in cities, work in factories, and create a diversity of products at different sort of stages. So we're going to go ahead and get started in talking about why industry happened in the United States. For us to understand industry in the United States, we have to understand first that America is resource rich. The United States has always had more natural resources than most other countries. Um, it is very rich in coal along the eastern coastline, oil in different parts of the middle of the country, and wood. So these are all things that you need for industry because you can burn them to create steam. You can burn them to heat water, which creates steam, which is the primary mechanism through which industrialization took place. The steam engine is really where you see a lot of major mechanical processes sort of begin. So we have that going for us. There's an abundance of resources that they could use for industry, and that provided a lot of the baseline for what they needed to begin to develop industry, and then it sort of spiraled from there. Immigration was also a factor. While they were building the factories in America, there were people pouring in from Europe and Asia. In particular, they were coming from Eastern Europe and from China, and these immigrants were treated very poorly when they got here, but they were put to work in cities, and they would often work very hard, um, long hours, and then they would be mistreated by the factory owners, but because they were immigrants, they couldn't necessarily stand up for themselves. So immigration provided a lot of cheap labor because you didn't have to pay the immigrants well because you were mistreating them, and it made it a lot easier for the factories to get off of the ground. The government at this time was very encouraging to businesses that wanted to industrialize. If you expanded your business, there were often reduced taxes. Government corruption, we'll talk about later, but that played a large part in helping many factories get off the ground as well. And then for the people that were trying to expand westward, there was offers of free land under the Homestead Act. We'll talk about that more in the next chapter. But it was there were a lot of benefits to building your business under the government of the 1870s to the 1890s. And then lastly, we've got to talk about the culture. And this is something that we need to understand because it's probably the part that is most relevant to us today. The United States has valued quote-unquote self-made individuals or people who work hard and do not ask for help. Self-made men and women, primarily men at this time, were the ones who were considered really living the American dream. You start with nothing and you build your way up. And so the idea of moving to a city, starting to work in the factory and making a fortune was really, really appealing to a lot of Americans. Whether or not that actually happened all of the time, we'll come to see. But that is definitely a driving force behind many Americans to go into the industrial economy. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see I put down what is one way you still see the factors that contributed to industrialization in the world today. That question is in red. It is a critical question, meaning that it's sort of a critical thinking question I put at the bottom of the slide, and I want you to think about it. In American history, you're going to make discussion posts based around these questions. So write the one down from the presentation that most sticks out to you, and we're going to use the discussion board because of that. For that, rather. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about technology, and technology is really important because it drove industrialization. There were a lot of new industries that created new jobs, and these industries were driven by workforce. They had a lot of workers that were pushing them, but at the head of the companies and the industries were figureheads, really, really wealthy businessmen who made a lot of money off of these new industries, and we're going to talk about them briefly. Steel production in America greatly increased during industrialization, and the sort of guy that we associate with steel production is Andrew Carnegie. You've probably heard it pronounced Carnegie as well, if you've ever heard of Carnegie Hall in New York. He is, or he was rather, an immigrant from Scotland. He came over here as a boy. He started working on the railroad, and he quickly moved up the ranks in the railroad company, and then eventually he became a manager for the railroad company, and from then he started making money and invested in different things, and got really big into the steel making business, particularly in Pennsylvania. What he ended up doing is building up his steel company, and then when he had the money to do so, he used a process called vertical integration. Vertical integration is one form of monopoly where what you do is so in his case, he wanted to make steel. So for steel, you have to have a lot of different things, but you have to have rail cars to transport the steel, coal to use in the steelmaking process, and iron to form the base of the steel. So what he would do is he would buy all of the companies that were responsible for any part of his product being produced. So he would buy the coal mines, he would buy the iron mines, he'd buy the railroads, and he would buy just straight up and down, so that from start to finish, he controlled every single aspect of the steel production process. This made it really cheap for him to produce things because he was in charge of the companies. So he got really good rates on transporting stuff because he was the one that owned the company, so he wasn't going to charge himself anything to move steel across the country. That made it easy for him to make even more money than he did. He ended up donating a large amount of his money to charity before he died. Oil is another huge industry at this time, and John D. Rockefeller is sort of the guy that sort of leads this all. And what he did is he used a process called horizontal integration, which is the most common form of monopoly that we know. Horizontal integration, the way that this works is he bought up all of his competing oil companies. So he made a lot of money off of oil, and then he used that money to buy up smaller companies until eventually he controlled the majority of oil in the United States. And his company was called Standard Oil. What would end up happening is the Supreme Court would look at it and say, this is a monopoly. Monopolies are illegal in the United States. We're going to split you up. And they divided it up into smaller companies. But that's how he made a lot of his money. He didn't have any competitors, so he could charge whatever he wanted for oil. And then lastly, banking at this time became really big. J.P. Morgan was a major investor who made a considerable amount of money investing in some of the new industries coming out, like Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's oil company. And he made that, and he sort of expanded his bank. And J.P. Morgan is still around today. If you know anyone that banks with J.P. Morgan Chase, it's one of the largest banks in the United States. And it's still around, and it still carries his name. He made a lot of money off of banking at this time. Okay. While all this is going on, there's a major development in American society. We start to see factories, which bring workers together. Factories develop in cities, and factories are a centralized location where workers come and they go to work and they do their job, and it's easy to manage, it's easy to oversee, because everything is centralized, it makes it a lot faster to create the product. The factory is sort of the centerpiece of industrialization. When people think of industrialization, the factory is really what comes to mind. And that's because it really represented all of the changes. It represented the sort of closeness that also came with urbanization, and it represented the sort of like the tight spaces that would come for people living in America's cities, which were oftentimes overcrowded. And then lastly, we've got to understand the growth of the city. And you can see here that I have color-coded these terms. The green terms are your vocab terms, and you'll have a quiz at the end of the module over these vocab terms. And so I've highlighted those in green, and these slides will be available on Canvas for you to look at. So for us to understand the city, before industrialization, most Americans lived on farms. But during industrialization, the development of factories You want your people to live in the city so they can go to the factory and work. That brought a lot of people there, and that process is known as urbanization. Urban, URBAN, means city, and urbanization is the process of people moving towards cities. Okay, so industrialization brings urbanization. It grows cities. People live primarily in the city now and not so much in the farm. And that's a huge development for American society, and it's going to result in a lot of changes to culture. Okay, so for your critical question, I went ahead and said, what are some new industries or technologies that have changed America today? I want you to think about that. How have they done that? What are some things that are coming out right now that are like industrialization are changing America, and how? Okay, so let's talk about wealth. And I touched on this briefly yesterday, or not yesterday, sorry, on the last slide. So what I want you to understand about wealth is that there was a lot of wealth at this time. You have a lot of people like Carnegie and Rockefeller making a lot of money very quickly, and they end up generating massive amounts of wealth while their workers aren't necessarily making a lot of it. And so this creates this dichotomy, or sort of like two sides to this issue. So some people consider them captains of industry. They invest in these companies, they industrialize, they provide a lot of growth and money and jobs for America, and so that's why they were considered captains of industry, because they were paving the way. But other people look and say, well, you're making a lot of the money, but the workers are the ones doing the work. So you're getting really, really wealthy while other people are poor, and they call them robber barons. The idea being that they were these really, really wealthy guys that were in charge of stuff, but they were robbing from the poor, by taking all the money that they were making from selling their products and not giving it out in the form of wages to the workers. This is an interesting debate, and it's still not sort of settled. And stuff with history, it's like everything else. People have different perspectives, and so some people really, really buy into the captains of industry argument. Other people are dead set on no, they were robber barons. It was unjust. It was unfair. You can sort of decide for yourself, and that's the critical question at the end of the slide. Do you think that the wealthy should be responsible for taking care of their workers? Why or why not? Okay. One of the ways that these guys got so much money, though, was through the monopoly. And if you're not familiar with the board game, the word monopoly, it means essentially one business in any particular industry. So let's use toothpaste as an example. When you go to buy toothpaste, you can go to the store and you can get probably whatever the Target or Walmart brand of toothpaste is, and then you can get Crest and Colgate and Aquacrest and all sorts of other. There are a lot of different toothpaste companies. Okay, but if you went to the store and all that was there was Colgate, Colgate would have what's called a monopoly, meaning they're the only people selling toothpaste. If they're the only people selling toothpaste and you need toothpaste, they can sell it at whatever gosh darn price they want, and you're going to pay for it because you need the toothpaste. Monopolies are like this. Standard Oil is the best example of this, where you have one oil company that sells most of the oil in the United States, and not a lot of other people have options. So John D. Rockefeller could charge whatever the heck he wanted for oil, and nobody could really argue with him because there weren't competitors. Another form of monopoly that isn't talked about as much is the vertical integration that Andrew Carnegie used. And you'll notice I color-coded vertical and horizontal, not because they're vocab words, but because we're comparing and contrasting. The vertical integration is another sort of monopoly, and the reason it's a monopoly is because you're not giving people options along the way. So because you control everything from the top to the bottom, it is you don't have to buy from other companies, and it makes it so that there is limited competition. So if most of the coal in the United States goes to making steel, and the guy who is making steel owns all of the coal mines. If I want to start a coal mine, I'm not going to be able to sell it at whatever I want because he's already making it and buying it for whatever price he wants because he's in charge of it. And the price that he would want would probably be free. Okay, so that's another example of a monopoly, although it's not the same sort of thing as horizontal integration, which is the more common form that you see. And that's the reason the board game is called Monopoly. The idea is that you want to buy up all of the properties so that you're in charge of the whole board. You want to have a monopoly over all of those, properties in the board game. That's the same thing. Horizontal integration is going to be the most common thing you're going to see when you talk about monopoly. Vertical integration is still technically legal, and Walmart is a good example of a company that kind of uses vertical integration. They create their own products, and they have their own shipping company, and they have their own store. So they don't involve a lot of third parties. But horizontal integration is illegal. If you're found guilty of being a horizontally integrated company, a monopoly, there are no other competitors, then the government will oftentimes force you to break up into smaller companies. Okay. While we're talking about wealth, we should also talk about labor, because they sort of are two sides of the same coin. Like I said before, people said they were robber barons because they weren't doing most of the work. The workers were, but they were making all of the money. Well, labor is just that. It's the people that are working for you. So we should talk about the workers at this time, because they are just as important to industrialization. Many of them were immigrants and young men. They moved from farms. There were women and children as well that came with the men, and they would also be working in factories, but they often made significantly lower wages. The men were coming from farms where what you would do is you would harvest your crop, and then you would sell it, and you make money from the crop that you harvested, and it wouldn't necessarily be how many hours you went in and put in, it's the product that you're making. Here, you see the development of a wage system. If any of you guys have jobs, most jobs use a wage system where you get paid a certain amount per hour for the work that you do. And workers at this time worked for wages, and they would work in the factory. They'd go there for 10 or 12 hours a day, and then they would make a certain amount per hour, and that's what they would bring home at the end of the day. Okay, so wages are the way that workers are making money at this time. And what ends up happening is you see these factories, which are super efficient. They're really, really fast, and they're also not very safe, and they're not always really clean, and they bring in profit. Profit is the amount of money that you make after you calculate all the things that you have to pay for. So after you pay for your workers in your factory, the amount of money that you end up making after that, that's profit. And the amount of profit that the business owners were making at this time was really, really crazy. They were making just tons of money all of the time. And the workers were looking at this, and they were seeing how the owners of the businesses were getting wealthy, and they got really unhappy. And they said, you know what, we're here, and it's not necessarily safe, and it's not necessarily clean, and we don't necessarily make that much money, so is this really fair? And they're going to ask that question, and it's going to become sort of central to one of the major conflicts of this time period. I want you to think about how you'd prefer to be paid. Would you prefer to be paid on a wage, so that you work for a certain amount of time and you make money for the time that you put in, or would you rather be paid for a finished product? So a good example of this is if you have ever bought anything on Etsy. Etsy is a really good example of a marketplace where people make products, and they get paid for the products, not necessarily the time. Farmers are also like this. You don't necessarily get paid for the time. You get paid for what you're selling. Okay, so because of labor, we start to see the development of these things called unions. And unions had been around in Europe before, but they start to catch on in the United States. And what happens is the unions look at the workers look at the working conditions of the factories they're working in, and they start to organize. And they say, you know what, we don't need to take this, and they form unions because of unity. And they look at health, and they say, you know what, there's a lot of dangers associated with this. People are losing limbs and machinery, and they're getting sick because they can't breathe, and there's all sorts of disease spreading, and they're really concerned about that. They also look at masculinity. It was really easy to convince people to join unions because they weren't necessarily happy with their situation. If you were a man in the 1880s or the 1890s, you were expected to make a living for your family, and a lot of them weren't proud of what they were doing. They're coming from farms where they created something with their hands, and they saw the end reward of that. And here they're working for someone else, and they're not necessarily seeing a product from start to finish. So a lot of individuals at this time become really concerned with masculinity, and that's where you get the phrase "Go west, young men." And people at the time would suggest, well, you don't like it in the factory, why don't you go make a living for yourself out on a farm? And that's something that happens that we'll talk more about. But the masculinity is definitely a major issue here as well. So what ends up happening is they organize and they form labor unions. The process here is known as unionization, again a vocab word. And some of the unions that they formed, one really good example of the Knights of Labor, and then also the American Federation of Labor, which is still around today. If you know anybody that is a member of a union and they're a member of AFL-CIO, that is the American Federation of Labor, AFL-CIO. So they fought for different things. AFL focused more on short-term gains, so specific issues like raising wages of particular factory workers or like in isolated locations. The Knights of Labor fought for things on a national scale, and they weren't around for as long, but what they did end up doing is they got us weekends, and they also fought for shorter days. Most of you are probably familiar with the 8-hour workday. That's what we sort of go on now in America, and that's a victory that the Knights of Labor secured for us. They fought against the factory workers and said, you know what? You need to not. They need to work less so they can spend time with their families, and they got us 8-hour days and higher wages. For this question, I just want to know if you guys know anybody who's a member of a labor union today. I know that a lot of you probably do. So if you do and you want to talk about your experience, feel free to do so. Okay, for the last slide here, what I want to show you is sort of what urbanization kind of looks like, and I included a map of England. One of the reasons I included a map of England is because it's important for you to understand that industrialization wasn't just going on in America at this time. It was also going on overseas, and England was the place for the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about it here because we're in a U.S. history course and we're studying America, but when you think of the Industrial Revolution on a global scale, England is really where it happened. So what you can see here, and I'll move my mouse and hopefully it'll work, yeah. So what you can see here is before, and in about 1701, everything was pretty evenly spread out. The darker spots are where population is more condensed. Here's London, which was the most populated area at the time, and it's not even that populated. But when you go over to 1911, partially because there are more people in the country, but also because they're concentrated around cities, you can see that the cities are the parts where it really grows. And so you have places up in Scotland. No, that's not Scotland. Sorry. You have up here, and then you've got Liverpool, and then you've got London, and over here, I think that might be Cardiff. And these are urban centers where people come from the farms and they concentrate in the cities, and it really just sort of explodes, and they become major population centers for people in this era. So that should help sort of give a visual to what urbanization looks like. This like sort of diverse, spread out thing to clusters of people, just clusters of population. So that should help you sort of visualize that. So. Okay, that's all I've got. So I will go ahead and put this online, and then you guys can check it out. And I will have the next lesson up tomorrow, and you can go from there. But if you have any questions, like always, just see me.